February 14th, 1933. Valentine's Day. The Cotton Club basement was silent except for the sound of 12 men breathing. Tommy, the executioner Vento, stood closest to the stairs, his hand resting inside his coat. Behind him, 11 of Dutch Schultz's most experienced enforcers waited in the shadows. They'd been there since 3 a.m., waiting for one man. Bumpy Johnson was 27 years old, still building his reputation in Harlem. Dutch Schultz was the most feared mobster in New York. Everyone knew how this would end. 12 professional enforcers against one young hustler in a basement with no witnesses and no way out. But what Dutch Schultz didn't understand about Bumpy Johnson was this: he didn't think like other men. He didn't fight like other men. And he certainly didn't die like other men. While others saw conflicts as tests of strength, Bumpy saw them as puzzles to be solved with intelligence and precision. 90 minutes later, only one of those 12 walked out alive, and the message he carried back to Dutch Schultz would change the balance of power in New York forever. More importantly, it would establish a principle that echoed through the underworld for decades. In Harlem, intelligence trumped firepower, strategy defeated numbers, and respect conquered fear. To understand what happened in that basement, you need to understand Harlem. This wasn't the Harlem Renaissance anymore. The Jazz Age was over. The Depression had hit Black America harder than anywhere else. Men who'd worn silk suits and owned their own businesses now stood in breadlines. Families who'd owned brownstones were crammed into single rooms. Hope was a luxury most people couldn't afford. But there was one form of hope that cost just a nickel: the numbers game. Harlem's illegal lottery was more than gambling. It was economic salvation. Bet a nickel on the right 3 numbers, and you could win $50. For people making $7 a week, that nickel represented everything: rent money, food money, medicine money, a way out. The mathematics were brutal, but the psychology was brilliant. Most players lost, but the few who won became neighborhood legends. Their success stories spread through barbershops, beauty salons, and church basements, creating a contagious sense of possibility that kept the money flowing. The numbers racket generated millions of dollars every year, and every ambitious criminal in New York City wanted a piece of it. But Harlem already had its rulers. Madame Stephanie St. Clair, known as the Queen of Numbers, controlled the game from her headquarters on 13 7th Street. She was a Caribbean immigrant who'd built an empire through intelligence, intimidation, and an absolute refusal to bow to anyone. And protecting that empire was a young man named Bumpy Johnson.
Bumpy wasn't just muscle. He was something more dangerous. He was strategic muscle. While other enforcers relied on fear and brutality, Bumpy understood psychology. He studied his enemies like a general studies battlefield maps. He learned their weaknesses, their habits, their fears. Bumpy had learned this approach during his time in Auburn prison, where he'd spent 2 years reading everything he could find: military strategy, psychology, philosophy. He'd learned that the mind was the most powerful weapon any man could possess. What made Bumpy truly dangerous was that he didn't fight for money. He fought for respect, and respect in Harlem was the most valuable currency of all. Respect meant that when you walked down 35th Street, conversations paused until you passed. Respect meant that problems got solved with phone calls instead of violence. But respect had to be earned and defended daily. When elderly families couldn't pay rent, Bumpy paid it without being asked. When white-owned stores raised prices unfairly, Bumpy had conversations that resulted in immediate corrections. This wasn't charity. It was investment in the community that protected him. Dutch Schultz saw all that money flowing through Harlem's numbers game, and decided he wanted it. All of it. Dutch was a German-Jewish mobster from the Bronx, who'd built his fortune during Prohibition. But Prohibition was ending, and Dutch needed a new empire. The numbers game was perfect: consistent revenue, minimal overhead, and it operated in communities largely ignored by law enforcement. But Dutch made a crucial calculation error. He assumed that taking over Harlem would be like taking over territory from other criminal organizations. He didn't understand that Harlem wasn't just territory, it was community, and community knew how to protect itself in ways that went beyond simple violence. Dutch also underestimated the sophistication of Harlem's existing infrastructure. Madame Claire's organization employed hundreds of people: runners who collected bets, accountants who managed cash flow, lookouts who watched for police raids, and enforcers who dealt with problems. This wasn't street-level hustling. It was a business with systems that couldn't be easily destroyed or replicated. January 1933. Dutch sent 3 representatives to meet with Madame St. Clair. They walked into her club on 33rd Street wearing expensive suits and confident smiles. They sat down at her table and delivered their message with the casual tone men use when they're absolutely certain they hold all the power. Work with Dutch Schultz, Pay him 50% of all numbers profits, accept his protection, or face the consequences. Madame Claire listened to their entire presentation without saying a word. She was 53 years old, a woman who'd survived poverty in the Caribbean, racism in America, and every attempt by men to control her business. When they finished talking, she looked each of them in the eye, and said 5 words that would echo through New York's underworld for decades.
Get out of my club. The representatives turned to Bumpy Johnson, who was standing quietly in the corner. The youngest of them, a man named Carlo Benedetto, smiled at Bumpy with the condescending expression men wear when they think they're talking to someone inferior. You want to be smart about this, boy. Dutch Schultz doesn't make the same offer twice. Bumpy didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at Carlo with eyes that seemed to see right through him. That stare, the one that made strong men suddenly remember they had somewhere else to be. Carlo's smile faded. The room felt colder. The 3 representatives left Madame St. Clair's club and reported back to Dutch Schultz that negotiation had failed. Dutch Schultz had never been told no by anyone, certainly not by a black woman and her young enforcer. His response was swift and brutal. If they wouldn't accept his partnership, he'd destroy them completely, starting with Bumpy Johnson. But Dutch made a crucial error in judgment. He assumed Bumpy was just another street thug. He didn't understand that Bumpy had spent years studying every aspect of conflict. Physical combat, psychological warfare, strategic planning. Bumpy understood that real power wasn't about who could hit hardest. It was about who could think fastest. February 13th, Bumpy received word that Dutch's men were planning to hit Madame St. Clair's main counting house on Lenox Avenue at dawn. The tip came from a police informant named Detective Ray Murphy, who'd been on Bumpy's payroll for 3 years. Murphy had overheard Dutch's lieutenant Tommy Vento discussing the plan at a bar in the Bronx. Bumpy could have simply avoided the counting house, could have warned Madame St. Clair to move the money, could have set up security and waited for Dutch's men to arrive. Instead, he made a decision that seemed like suicide. He would go to the Cotton Club basement alone. The Cotton Club basement wasn't the famous nightclub where white audiences went to hear black musicians. This was the real Cotton Club, an after-hours establishment where Harlem's players came to drink, gamble and settle scores. The basement was used for storage poker games, and occasionally conversations that needed to happen away from curious ears. It was also the perfect place for an ambush. Single entrance through a narrow staircase. No windows, no back door. Once you were down there, the only way out was back up those stairs. February 14th, 1933, 4:32 a.m. Bumpy Johnson descended those stairs knowing exactly what waited for him. He could have avoided this confrontation entirely. Instead, he chose to face 12 professional enforcers alone. This wasn't bravado. This was calculation. Sometimes the only way to end a war is to fight a battle so decisive that your enemy loses the will to continue. The basement was dark, except for a single light bulb swinging from the ceiling. The air smelled of stale beer and something else, fear mixed with adrenaline. 12 men had been waiting in those shadows for over an hour, and then he heard it, the unmistakable sound of safeties being released from firearms. 12 distinct clicks. Tommy, the executioner, Vento, stepped forward. Tommy had ended 16 lives in his career, always at close range, always looking his victims in the eye. He was Dutch Schultz's most reliable enforcer. Dutch Schultz sends his regards, Tommy said, his voice echoing in the enclosed space. Bumpy stood there, hands at his sides, face completely calm. Most men, when faced with overwhelming odds, showed fear. Bumpy showed nothing. He looked like he was waiting for a bus rather than facing execution. Bumpy stood there, hands at his sides, face completely calm. He looked around the room slowly, counting, 12 men, all armed, all experienced, all convinced they were about to complete the easiest contract of their careers. Bumpy looked back at Tommy and said something that no one expected. That all he sent? Tommy's confident expression faltered slightly. Here was a man facing certain elimination, outnumbered 12-1, and he was asking if Dutch could have sent more people. You got about 10 seconds to beg for your life, Tommy said, raising his weapon. Bumpy tilted his head slightly, like he was genuinely curious about something. You're making a mistake. What mistake? You're about to be eliminated. The mistake, Bumpy said slowly, is thinking I came here alone. 12 weapons stayed trained on him, but now there was hesitation, doubt. Tommy glanced toward the stairs. He saw nothing, heard nothing, looked back at Bumpy. You're bluffing. Bumpy smiled for the first time since entering the basement. Then shoot.
but nobody shot. Because here's what Dutch Schultz's men didn't understand about Bumpy Johnson. He'd been fighting since he was 10 years old. Street fights in Charleston, South Carolina. Prison riots in Auburn. Wars over territory with every gang that thought they could muscle in on Harlem. He'd learned something that most men never learn. Violence has a rhythm. And right now, standing in that basement, Bumpy controlled the rhythm. What happened next would be debated in Harlem, barbershops, and pool halls for decades. The surviving members' testimony was fragmented, confused, contradictory. But here's what everyone agrees on. Bumpy moved first. Not toward a weapon, not toward the stairs. He moved toward the light. One swift motion, and the hanging bulb shattered against the ceiling. Complete darkness. Then chaos. In that darkness, Dutch Schultz's 12 experienced enforcers became 12 confused men shooting at shadows. They couldn't see Bumpy. They couldn't see each other. They could only hear movement, and fear makes men shoot at any sound. Bumpy knew that basement like he knew his own apartment. He'd played poker there dozens of times. He knew every crate, every table, every corner. Dutch's men were fighting blind in unfamiliar territory against an opponent who understood that the greatest weapon isn't always the deadliest. Sometimes it's simply knowing exactly where you are when your enemy doesn't. The violence lasted approximately 3 minutes. 3 minutes that felt like 3 hours to the one man who survived to tell the story. When someone finally opened the basement door from upstairs and let light spill down those steps, here's what they found. 11 bodies on the floor, not all eliminated, but all incapacitated. Broken bones, gunshot wounds from friendly fire, unconsciousness, severe injuries, and one man sitting against the wall, hyperventilating, his weapon still gripped in shaking hands. Marty Icepick Delaney, the only conscious survivor. Bumpy Johnson was nowhere to be found. He'd vanished like smoke. Marty crawled up those stairs. Every step was agony, broken ribs, maybe worse. It took him 20 minutes to reach street level. He flagged down a taxi with blood-soaked money and gave the driver an address in the Bronx. Arthur Avenue, Dutch Schultz's headquarters, 8:17 a.m. Marty stumbled into Dutch's social club. Dutch was eating breakfast. Eggs, toast, coffee, reading the morning newspaper. He looked up, saw Marty covered in blood, and went completely still. "Where are the others?" Marty couldn't speak at first, just shook his head.
"Where are my men?" "Gone," Marty finally whispered. "All of them. He let me live to give you a message." The entire room went quiet. Dutch's lieutenants, accountants, bodyguards. Everyone stopped what they were doing and watched. "What message?" Marty reached into his jacket. Dutch's men reached for their weapons, thinking Marty might be armed. But Marty pulled out something else entirely. A single playing card. The ace of spades, covered in blood. He placed it on the table in front of Dutch. "He said to tell you Harlem's not for sale. And if you send more men, send more cards. He's collecting a deck." Dutch Schultz stared at that card for a long time. His men waited for orders. Waited for Dutch to unleash hell. To send 50 men to burn Harlem to the ground. Instead, Dutch picked up the card, studied it, then did something no one expected. He smiled. Not a happy smile. A smile of resignation, of recognition, of respect for an opponent who demonstrated something rarer than courage, tactical brilliance. "He's got intelligence," Dutch said quietly, "and that's more dangerous than courage." "Boss, we can't let this stand," one of his lieutenants protested. "Every small-time gang from Boston to Philadelphia will think they can challenge us if word gets out." Dutch held up his hand and the room fell silent. "You know what it costs to go to war with someone who's not afraid to pass away? Someone who's smarter than you? Someone who has an entire neighborhood behind him, people willing to follow him into situations like this?" He shook his head slowly, processing the implications of what had just happened. "It costs everything. And for what? Numbers money in Harlem? There's easier money to be made elsewhere. Places where the locals don't have leaders capable of turning 12 against 1 into a complete victory." Dutch Schultz dropped the card in an ashtray and lit it on fire. As it burned, he made a decision that would reshape New York's criminal landscape. "We're done in Harlem. Let Bumpy Johnson have it. Anyone who can orchestrate something like this deserves to keep what he's protecting. We'll find our fortune elsewhere."